Ibrahim is an architect and planner who graduated from Cairo University in 1995. In 1997, he worked on the UNDP's historic Cairo rehabilitation project. And then he started working for the Aga Khan Cultural Services on a very important project that many of you probably know about, the Azhar Park and Darbal Ahmar revitalization project. This was a project that had several components to create a large park on a centuries-old landfill outside the historic wall. It also involved restoration of the 12th century wall itself and revitalization of the adjacent neighborhood. Kareem was the coordinator of the built environment / housing component, and in 2008 that project was awarded, recognized as an international best practices project by UN Habitat. In 2009 he co-founded Takween Community Development, and he's been working on a range of issues including sustainable architecture, participatory planning, affordable housing, public infrastructure, and urban revitalization throughout Egypt with various local and international organizations. He's also a consultant to UNESCO on several projects for historic Cairo. He is co-leader of Tadammun, which is the Cairo Urban Solidarity Initiative, which is an initiative that aims at encouraging citizens to claim their right to the city and its democratic management. And for those of you who would like to hear more about that, Kareem is going to be presenting with his co-leader, Diane Singerman, at American University on the Cairo Urban Solidarity Initiative on Monday at American University from 12 o'clock to 2. So please join me in welcoming Kareem Ibrahim.
Good evening. First, I'd like to thank Michelle actually for giving me this opportunity to speak about heritage issues in Egypt and what really happens right now in a country like Egypt in terms of like the conflicts that are taking place that also have its own repercussions in the countries of the Arab Spring. And to do that, it's like difficult to focus the discussion on one topic or something that's related to one specific subject to heritage. So what I'm going to do is to go through different contexts actually and to raise several issues that has to do not only with heritage but also its relation to democracy and what's happening in the Arab world right now. But first let me start with a story actually that happened by the end of 2011. There were like some conflicts between like the government and some of the revolutionaries that took place near Tahrir Square. This is the place where like most of the revolutionary events took place in Cairo, which is downtown. And it was in the end of December 2011 when these like clashes erupted. And as a result of the clashes and during the clashes, there was like a fire that affected what we call the Egyptian Scientific Institute, which is an establishment actually that was established by the French in 1798. And the building was completely burned down in 2011 during these clashes. In fact, the building had almost like 200,000 like very rare books and documents that was there in the building. And only 30,000 of them have been saved, including like original copies of the Description de l'Egypte, which is like the famous book on Egypt. And one of these copies was burned during the fire. These documents were mainly saved by the revolutionaries themselves because there haven't been any ambulance or like, fire service or whatever, or even government officials to save the building. However, the way that the incident was predicted in the media, that the revolutionaries actually, or the protesters, burned down this place, and actually that was a major loss for heritage of Egypt. And the story that has been told in the media, it's a great loss to Egypt's heritage. But nobody discussed that 99% of Egyptians didn't know that this building existed or the institute exists in the first place, and including very intellectual people. And people suddenly discovered that we had such a building, it was burned down, it had these documents. And the discussion also ignored that during these 2 days of the clashes, like 26 people died and there were like 2,000 injuries during the same clashes. So it started raising actually two sorts of questions. First is that, what's the value of heritage in time of conflicts? If we have like 26 people died during these clashes, what's the value of these books that has been burnt over there? And second, what's the value of heritage if it's not accessed, people don't know about it, it's not like available for the public. It's there, sitting there, and people don't do anything with it. So this leads me to my discussion today, is like the relationship between heritage and the revolution, and like this moment that we're going through actually in the Arab world. And the value of heritage through this discussion and how actually we can build upon it. So first let me tell you a little bit about the background of like my city, of like Cairo, and what's the situation over there. Egypt is a country, like many different countries in the developing world, that is rapidly urbanizing. 44% of like the population are currently living since 2012 in urban areas, with an increase rate of like 2% annually. So, which is higher than the national rate, so Egypt is rapidly urbanizing. And this puts a lot of pressure on the urban areas that we're living in. Second, we have almost like 12 million inhabitants out of 85 million, that's the population of Egypt, are living in what we call informal areas or slums. And half of this figure lives in the Greater Cairo region. That's like, somehow we have like, Greater Cairo has almost 90 million inhabitants, 6 million of them are living in informal areas. Some people estimate this figure even to go even higher. And finally, we have like, let's say, young nation, we have more than like 60% of the population, between 60 to 65% are under 30. All these figures are putting a lot of pressure on existing urban areas and also like historic areas that are within the city itself. Another phenomenon that we have is like the informal areas that are rapidly growing around the city. So this is a map of Cairo, and what you see, all these colored spots actually are informal areas that have been growing since the 1970s. But also to put you in context, this like small dot, this yellow dot, is the historic city of Cairo. So the rest is like, has been growing over the last like 150 years. This is how like an informal area look like in Cairo, which is like mostly a built-up area that it's like structurally sound, but unfortunately it lacks a lot of services and public utilities. And meanwhile, we have other areas that, for example, represent the inner city core. This is the area of Darb al-Ahmar, where we've been working for almost like 13 years there. And it represents like a classic example of like a historic center that has been abandoned and people left it because of social and economic degradation. So there have been some urban upgrading efforts in Egypt since like the last decade, or at least the last 2 decades. And one of them was the GIZ, which is the German Technical Cooperation organization that has been working on focusing on urban issues in informal areas, especially addressing issues like urban governance and democracy and urban management. Other projects that focused on the inner city problems, like the Aga Khan Trust for Culture program that has been active in historic Cairo between 1997 and 2010. And there have been some governmental efforts that we're going to tackle a little bit in a while that has been affected by the international donor projects that have been taking place in the city. Then there was a revolution in 2011, as you all know, and people just went out to the streets. We've been able to at least to change the ruling powers. By then, we're still struggling with the regime trying to change it. It still upholds itself until now, but it's been like over the last 3 years there have been a lot of events that have been taking place not only in Egypt but all in the Arab world that are like similar, that try to bring about democracy to our context. Unfortunately, the impact of the revolution on urbanism and heritage has been mostly negative. However, there have been like very good attempts of like local people have been like, for example, local groups of youth and local citizens that have been trying to take over things by their own hands, like, and take action. And they have been passive over the last 3 decades. So for example, they have been like guiding, like, or running like shaming campaigns against the government for calling for like better public services and better utilities from the government. However, on the other hand, there have been some like efforts that led either by the government or international donor agencies to focus on urban upgrading issues. Some of them are not directly led by like the desire to have like a better city, but to absorb the like demands for like better services and better quality utilities in these neighborhoods. On the other hand, there have been like let's say damage because of like incidents like what happened, for example, last month in end of January, the explosion that hit the Islamic Museum. And this museum was actually built in 1884, this building that you see in the picture. And it has been 8 years under restoration, opened only for 1 or 2 years, and then there was this explosion that completely damaged the building itself. There have been looting of like different museums in different places of the country. This was like a museum in Upper Egypt, and actually people came to know that there was a museum there after it was looted, because nobody knew that the museum existed. There have been vandalism and looting of archaeological sites, illegal excavation everywhere in the country, so there have been like a lot of smuggling of monuments, antiquities. And unfortunately, the demolition of many architecturally significant buildings. This building you see in the picture is very famous now in the country. It's in Alexandria. It was built by Auguste Piret, the famous French architect. It's one of 3 buildings that he built in Egypt. And it was like a very early attempt of use of like concrete. It was completely demolished, as you see, last month because of like conflicts in the existing laws and heritage protection regulations in the country. And finally, there is like illegal construction all over the country, but especially in historic areas, because there have been, let's say, very strict regulations at some point in terms of like building heights that have been completely loose since the last 3 years. The government is not able to implement any of these regulations. And the result is, as you see, is like we have like these like high-rise buildings coming up in historic neighborhoods. So we had like, there was a famous statement that came up last month or even this month. It says that like since 2011, we've been living in the era of the great downfall of Egyptian urbanization. The guy who said it is in charge of something called the National Organization for Urban Harmony. And if anybody asks, actually, their function is as silly as their name, actually. It's like they claim to harmonize the existing urban fabric, which is like something that is like completely, it's an illusion, actually. But it's, anyway, they're responsible somehow for listing the buildings, the residential buildings or like important architecturally significant buildings in the country, into lists that could be protected, like the villa that you've seen. But however, people know how to go out of this by using even legal ways to demolish their buildings in the end. However, I differ like with this sentence. The problem of like what we're seeing right now is not because of the revolution. The revolution just exposed the, let's say, the dysfunctional aspect of the government and how the system is completely in need of entire change. And to address these questions, I'm addressing like 3 different aspects. Actually, how heritage is managed and protected in a country like Egypt. Second, who benefits from heritage in terms of revenues and actually how like heritage works for the local community. And third, who defines what's heritage in a country like Egypt. And to start with the first one, the first question, I'd like to go quickly through the case of historic Cairo and the Darb al-Ahmar project that I was privileged to work on, and also my colleague Deborah Rodriguez here. Historic Cairo, actually, it's been a World Heritage Site since 1979. And it's a huge like area. It's almost like 3 square kilometers of urban fabric that is full of like listed buildings, existing traditional fabric of like dates back to the 19th century, a lot of like traditional crafts and businesses and social and economic networks that have been active in the city since like almost a century or more. And part of this neighborhood or part of this area is Darb al-Ahmar, which is almost the middle part of the entire site, the historic site, which is actually one of the most populated areas of historic Cairo. The project of the Aga Khan that started in 1997 actually started with the idea to build a park in historic Cairo that on a site that has been abandoned for at least 4 or 5 centuries. It used to be a garbage dump and it was never been used, and the idea to build a park there was mainly to build upon the, let's say, the advantages of the site itself, of being close to the historic city, having a site like this that has never been developed for centuries. So this site was picked in 1997 and construction work started over there until the year 2005 when the park was opened. And the park actually became a major attraction not only for the citizens or like inhabitants of the neighborhood, but the entire city. Almost like 2 million visitors actually visit the park every year, and it became like a green lung for the entire city. However, when the park project started, there was also the idea of like how to develop the adjacent or the neighboring area of Darb al-Ahmar, which was suffering from a lot of like physical deterioration, social and economic problems. And also there has been like a group of monuments that actually that was in need of like a great effort for restoration, for example. So one of them was the historic wall that dates back to the 12th century, that was completely buried with garbage and debris when we started working in the park. And the project had to, let's say, remove almost like 1 million cubic meter of debris from on top of the wall to expose it and restore it. The project, the restoration, the project of restoring the historic wall, it took over almost like 12 years of continuous work. It used a lot of like, let's say, people from the neighborhood that have been trained on the restoration activities and work over there. And finally, the project has been able to restore the wall and actually to expose major parts of it and use it like as a visitor's destination from the park and also from the neighborhood. However, the neighborhood itself, although like it was enjoying a lot like of privileges, like it was very central in the city itself. It enjoyed a lot of like historic monuments in the neighborhood, and it has like a significant number of like crafts and businesses and strong social networks within the neighborhood. It was like suffering from continuous deterioration. First, there have been like in the 1970s and until the mid of the 80s, there have been like a complete mismanagement of this part of the city, and a lot of like illegal buildings came up that completely destroyed several parts of the fabric of the city. But also there was the issue of poverty and urban poverty in the neighborhood, that most of the people that have been leaving the neighborhood were the better off actually, because they were the ones who afforded to go to other neighborhoods that are even better, that had better services or infrastructure. So the result that we ended up with a community that is almost 70% living under the poverty line. So this was also another dimension that the project had to deal with. So in order to address these reasons of deterioration, the project was composed of physical and social components actually that worked together on the revitalization of the neighborhood. So the physical components included planning, open space, upgrading, housing rehabilitation, and restoration and even building of public buildings to serve the needs of the neighborhood. But also it went along with like economic programs that provided access to microcredit, employment opportunities, not only in the project activities, but also get access to outside markets, and basic social services in terms of health, education, and environment. So I'm going to like show some like slides on what happened in the physical part, because there have been a lot of dimensions to this project. But one of the programs that have been active in the project was a housing rehabilitation program that started into operation in 2002, between 2002 and 2008. And we managed through this program to restore more than 120 houses in the neighborhood, to like work with the local citizens or the inhabitants over there to share the cost of rehabilitation and to cooperate working with them in terms of like deciding what needs to be done to their houses. And we've been able to somehow show that it's possible actually to invest in housing in such neighborhoods, and this process can be rewarding to first maintain the existing population, and second to attract more people to come to the neighborhood. Another dimension of the program was to work on rehabilitation or restoration of existing public buildings, and this was one of the buildings that the project restored. It was an Arab building that was constructed, I think, around 1905, and it was abandoned when the project came to the area, but the project managed to restore it and reuse it as part of the administration, like headquarters, and to serve the different programs of the project, and also to be used by the local community as meeting space and gathering spaces. Another dimension was to work on the existing public open spaces through participation with local inhabitants, and as you see, like we've been building models to work with them to decide what needs to be done in the public space. So you can see like the difference in one of the public spaces over there that has been designed with the local population over there. And also it involved like the restoration of some of the buildings and the square, and also an introduction of new commercial services and economic services in the neighborhood that would serve the needs of the inhabitants. And finally, the project was like, one of its major achievements was the completion of a conservation plan of the entire neighborhood, which was the first of its kind to be introduced within the administrative system in Cairo. to be working this thorough on like plot by plot like level to understand the problems and try to propose solutions on this like very small scale. The plan was ratified by the government in 2005 and it became the official plan for the management of the neighborhood. In parallel, there was another effort that was like spearheaded by the government itself in the northern part of the city to work on the major like spine of historic Cairo. It's called the Baiza Street, which is a street which is like almost like 1,000 years old. It has a lot of almost like 30 registered monuments along the street, and it's one of the most important streets in Egypt, if not the Arab world. So it was the government attempt to work over there, and they changed their policy from only focusing on like scattered monuments or listed buildings to work on an entire neighborhood or a part of a neighborhood in terms of infrastructure, public open space, housing issues. So this was a major shift actually of the government approach over there. And the project was so successful in a way that completed an entire trench of like, let's say, part of the neighborhood that has been like physically upgraded. Unfortunately, the project lacked any kind of participation with the inhabitants, but physically it wasn't able to change the face of the neighborhood over there. However, after the revolution, there have been, as I mentioned before, this like rampant wave of like illegal construction. So all what you see over here, this was like the traditional buildings, the type of traditional building that existed in the neighborhood. And actually, the building regulations over there were only limiting the height of buildings to be not more than 2-story high, like these buildings you see. But that's what happened actually after the revolution, is that everything broke loose. There was no public administration available, so people just started building and investing in real estate over there that had been deprived from doing so for almost like 2 or 3 decades. The result is like catastrophic because it lays a lot of like burden on the existing infrastructure, but more importantly, it destroyed the quality of life in this neighborhood entirely. And people actually are suffering right now who have been living in the neighborhood because of this like kind of pressure on the existing infrastructure. Having people coming from outside of the neighborhood actually living there with them and trying to change the way they are living. More than like 80% of the population there have been living in the neighborhood for more than 20 years. So it's a very stable population, and now it's changing the entire social mix. This mainly happened because, not only because of lack of like guidelines, because there was a plan there. It's not an issue of like having a plan or like to say like what needs to be done in terms of like physical conservation of existing fabric. The main point is that the local administration was so weak. The level of investment on the local level in Egypt is very little. So for example, Egypt spends out of its national budget between 12 and 16% on the local level, which is like very minimal. Afghanistan, this figure goes up to 42%. So you can imagine the difference actually between like the level of investment in the local government. As a result, this is what we see right here, is that you don't have any capacity on the local level to monitor or even manage the existing urban problems. Not needless to say heritage, because this is a second priority to the government actually. So the whole management structure is like dysfunctional since before the revolution. It's not something that came up suddenly or all of a sudden. It just like couldn't bear the pressures that has been put right there, but it has been dysfunctional from the beginning. Second is like who benefits from heritage. And I would like to discuss here the case of Luxor, which is one of like the cities in Upper Egypt that's very famous of like its listed monuments, and like it's a tourist destination in the country, if not the biggest. But it's, there have been several projects that have been taking place there over the last 10 years to have more tourists actually coming to the city, which is somehow works against any kind of like conservation plan that would be done. It's actually suffering from over-tourism and like over-consumption of tourism of the city itself. So it receives like hundreds of thousands of visitors in sites that are completely endangered by these visits. And yet the government started to work on more plans to have more tourists actually coming to the city and try to change the face of the city to be more appealing to this tourism industry. So in an attempt to make it more appealing, there was a governor of Luxor in 2010 that started like a major, let's say, an urban renewal plan, they call it like that, or like an upgrading plan. And he started to demolish like significant parts of the city itself to expose what we call the Avenue of the Sphinx, which is like an avenue that existed during the pharaonic times that connects two major temples in the city. And the distance between them is almost like 2 kilometers. And they had to cut through the entire city for a distance of 2 kilometers to expose this avenue. And the whole idea was to make it more appealing to tourists. But to do that, they demolished more than 200 or 250 like historic buildings that existed from other eras actually in the city. Like for example, 18th and 19th century buildings that were demolished, and they were like very rich buildings. Actually, they were mansions of rich families that used to live there, and all of that to make it more appealing to tourists. And the process is, as you see, they actually built the road. So it was completely damaged when they exposed it, and they had to build it even out of concrete in some areas. And there was like bulldozers going all around and the site and trying to build this road and connect the two temples together. And to do that, as I said, they had to cut through the city. So this building, for example, was cut in two parts, and you can find, like for example, here there was a door on the upper floor because they had to cut the building, and many of these buildings actually have been treated like that. And they had to evict a lot of inhabitants actually to other areas, mostly on agricultural land where they built in other informal areas and to like accommodate the population that has been migrated from this part of the city. And this was the result, and they created these public open spaces. This is like 50 degrees centigrade in the sun if you're sitting there, and they had these like huge public open spaces that nobody's using. So nobody visited these spaces after they were like established like that. During the same time, I was like responsible with some colleagues to work on a similar plan, upgrading plan of like, again, another city center that's 60 kilometers to the south of the same city, and it belongs to the same governor with the same mentality. And we had to convince him to act like in a different manner. And I'll show you the plan actually that we prepared for the city itself. We did it actually not for the municipality or the governorate, we did it for something called the Informal Settlements Development Facility, because unfortunately they considered the area around a famous temple in the city as informal or unsafe. So they commissioned us to do a plan for this like part of the city, which is actually the city center of like this area. It's called Esna, and it's located 60 kilometers to the south of Luxor, and it's very famous for its temple. You know, it's called the Esna Temple, and it was a tourist destination until the 1990s. And in fact, it was a very active urban center during, even from the Greco-Roman times. It has been like a commercial hub for the entire like region, and had been commercially active in this region in the south until like the 19th and the early 20th century. In the 1940s, or like, 1920s, there was like a dam or like a barrage that was built besides Esna. And for Nile cruises that were crossing between Luxor and Aswan, Esna was located in the middle, they had to cross this dam. So there were like weekly, there have been almost like 350 Nile cruises that had to stop for 8 hours every week to cross this dam. And during that time, all the tourists actually on these like ships, they had to go and visit the city because they had nothing else to do, anything else to do. So the city really flourished between the 1950s and the 1980s. Until the mid-90s, the government built a new dam actually that enabled the ships to go through in 1 hour or even less. So out of the 350 cruises, Nile cruises, only 13 of them, 1/3, stopped by the city. So the whole economy of the city fell down because it became completely dependent on tourism. And this was like how it looked like. This is downtown Isna in 2010, and it was this for 6 days a week. Tourists only came once a week, and the rest it was closed. So we had to act on that, and we had to see what needs to be done. Everybody in the government was telling us, okay, we need to like revive tourism and bring tourists back to the city. You know, the whole economy is falling apart. So we did a study within these boundaries that you can see in the photo. This is the temple itself in the middle. This is the Nile. And this is how like tourists actually used to access the temple. They just come from the Nile side and visit it, and then go back to their boats and leave. And it was like a very short visit actually for them during that time. When we came there, out of like 1,000 properties, only like 400 were inhabited. The rest was empty. And there was like fancy buildings actually of like very rich families that were there, but they left the city, and I'll tell you why very shortly, why did this happen. Second, we discovered that it's like the multi-layers of history within the city. First is that it's not only about the temple, it's being promoted in the tourist programs as like the Temple of Esna, but we found a lot of like Coptic Islamic and even modern times like heritage that can be promoted, and the city actually can be visited for its like very rich experience actually that you can see there, even traditional crafts that don't exist anywhere else. So there are multi-layers of history that have been ignored only to show the temple and how it's like looks like. The architecture of the city itself is fascinating. This is how like this is like traditional buildings that are there. It's like, and most of 90% of the buildings within the historic center are like that. You have traditional crafts that have been reviving, like surviving in the city for almost like century, where like it has been a center for the entire region for people to like make clothing, traditional clothing over there. So completely dependent actually not on tourism, on its own local economy. It's not like, it didn't need tourism to do that. So what we found that is because the government perceived this as a touristic area, they turned it into like almost like a sanitized zone. So first, they stopped any kind of restoration or building within the entire zone of the city center. There was like a moratorium on construction. Nobody was able to build anything. Second, they put like police checkpoints actually to secure the tourists. And to do that, they put it in very central locations where like the local residents and local visitors from the villages came to the local market. They were stopping them actually from going there. There hasn't been any attempt from the government to provide any technical support for the inhabitants. There hasn't been even a sewage network in the city center. It has been completely ignored to protect the temple. And finally, there have been like a traffic hub that was very close to the city center that has been relocated in order not for the villagers to annoy the tourists coming to the temple. So with the lack of tourism, the city center lost completely its entire local economy and it fell down. The brown buildings that you see are like the buildings that are in poor condition because of this neglect and lack of any kind of maintenance that was taking place there. So the majority of the buildings actually were in very bad condition. So for us actually to reverse this decline, what we did is that we said first is that the first thing is that you need to focus on the local economy. Forget about tourism actually. People had the means actually. There have been very strong social and economic networks within the city that has been capable of restoring anything actually, but have been stopped by the authorities to do that. So the first step was to bring back the local economy and the local trade actually as the major source of income to the city itself. Second is to focus on cultural tourism and responsible tourism rather than like mass tourism. So people would spend more time. This like path, for example, was the only path for tourists actually to visit the temple and go back, but you can actually spend more time in the city and even you can stay at night over there. And third is to strike a balance between urban conservation, which was actually the dominant factor within the city, to not try to freeze everything for the expense of like heritage and conservation and tourism, and to bring back the needs of the local inhabitants to the picture and to think of like modern development needs within the city itself. We had to do a plan, actually a plot-by-plot plan, and there hasn't been a map for the city, so we had to survey these plots ourselves on site and to do all the studies that we needed. And we took down the whole idea to the plot-by-plot level to show that it's like we give enough care and attention to these buildings and actually we look at them and try to propose very sensitive interventions. And the reason why we're doing that, we're very keen not to evict anybody from the city center. So we managed to come up with a plan that actually not only maintains the local population, but accepts more inhabitants to come back and start investing in the city itself. We showed them different examples of what needs to be done. This is the local market, or let's say the traditional market over there. This image is from Tunisia. We've been trying to show them different examples of how to restore such buildings. This was a caravanserai or a wakala in the city that was completely ignored and abandoned. We tried to work with them as how to reuse it, either to become like a local restaurant or something that can be used for the benefit of like tourism industry and to revive this wakala again. However, the governor at the same time was preparing a different plan. So when we showed him our plans, he listened to it and he liked it, and then he said, but listen, I have another plan I'd like to show you that I've been working on for the last couple of months. So what he did is that he demolished the entire city center, removed it entirely, and he excavated the city for a level between 5 to 9 meters below ground level because the temple actually was sunken in the city itself. You had to go down to it, so he exposed it from the Nile side. And he moved this monument. It was here, but it would look nicer if it's here, so he moved it actually to another place. This is almost like 1,000 years old minaret. And all of what you see here is like new fabric. He demolished the entire like area and he rebuilt new houses. And when we were asking about like the traditional fabric in the city, what would you do with it? So he said, okay, I'm building traditional buildings again, you know, on these terraces. So it's like, he's like reconstructing the entire history of the city and to make it work only for the temple, actually. And his idea was, if like tourists like see the temple from the Nile, they would be interested to come and visit, you know, as if like this is the thing that's going to change their opinion. And this was like his idea, and actually implemented such ideas in Luxor. So it wasn't like, it was scary because we knew that he's capable of doing such plans. It's not something out of fantasy. However, in Luxor, actually, there was like much protest after the revolution, especially from like very violent, let's say, policies of the government over there, expropriating lands and demolishing of existing buildings. And people started to reappropriate their lands again. So they came after the revolution and they took over the lands that had been expropriated. And now everything is frozen in the city. None of these plans are going forward. Even the plans for ESNA, the Prime Minister selected our plan to be implemented, but in the end it got frozen because of the revolution. So nothing is moving right there, but like what they built over the last 3 or 4 years to serve tourists has completely gone away and it's been lost. Third, who defines heritage? And here I would like to talk more about like the modern memory of the revolution, because it's also heritage. So from our point of view, it is something that's heritage in the making, and the way it's being perceived and it's being documented is like really interesting to see in a country like Egypt, and also for the rest of the Arab world. So I'm talking here about the case of Tahrir Square, a couple of incidents that I would like to show that show like how the state and the people actually trying to rewrite history in the making. In 2011, November 2011, there were like very brutal events that took place in a street that comes off Tahrir Square. It's called Muhammad Mahmud Street, where over 2 weeks there have been like very violent confrontations between the police forces and some of the revolutionaries, and it ended up was like 61 people killed, and the government fell down because of this like these confrontations. And it was like there were like thousands of people who got injured, in fact. And the street itself, it became like a symbol for the revolution, for the resistance, for the regime that existed after the revolution and what happened next. So young people started like drawing graffiti all over the street and to memorize the dead, actually, and the martyrs of the revolution. So, and in different events. In fact, it's not only about the Muhammad Mahmud like events, but also things that took place even after the revolution. So they were like drawing the memories, the photos of their friends and images of the revolution. But the government was coming back every once in a while and painted over all these graffitis. So it's like as if they wanted to erase all the memory or the resistance actually of like disuse against the government itself. So you come back and redraw an entirely different thing because the events are like shifting. So there are many layers of documentation of this street with the events actually that have been taken place in the revolution. So there are even 4 or 5 phases actually of graffiti work that has been taking place in the street, and it's almost the government comes back and then like tries to paint the walls, and then they go back and repaint it. So it's like a competition actually to claim and appropriate space and memory actually of this part of downtown. However, the government wanted to do another thing, which was like to build a memorial for the martyrs of the revolution in Tahrir Square. And they did that in November 2013. It was a counter movement actually of the government to show that they care about the martyrs, especially after the June 30th events and the overthrow of like the Muslim Brothers of Power. But they knew that nobody's actually supporting such a plan. So they had to evict the entire square to build this like memorial. And this is how it looked like during the day of the inauguration of the memorial. And this is how the Prime Minister came and inaugurated the memorial. You can see the guys with machine guns actually protecting a memorial that actually is supposed to memorize the people actually that have been died there. So immediately after they left, people started to approach the memorial, and there was nothing written but the name of the president, the name of the ministers, and so on and so forth. There's nothing about the martyrs of the revolution. And voila, actually, that's what happened in the evening. They started destroying the entire monument. And this is the second day, actually, this is how it came out. So they put their flags on and they destroyed the entire memorial, actually, in one day. The government came and rebuilt it again. and then they destroyed it again. And it's becoming like this narrative. And actually the two sides are almost like 300 meters away from each other. And it's like always this like waves of like the government trying to impose its official narrative of the revolution and people trying to impose their narrative. So this is another thing actually that we're facing, and it's completely going forgotten through like the discussion on heritage, is that who defines heritage in this case? Is it the people or the government? Because this also applies to the entire like way our heritage is being listed. It's not people who are deciding actually which buildings that like make sense to them are important to their heritage and culture. It's the government that decides so. So in the end, people don't care actually about which buildings are being listed or not. So there have been a lot of like bottom-up efforts after the revolution actually to try to protect even heritage, either buildings or neighborhoods, or like to try to attempt to do something about like this case of deterioration. So we see like, for example, protests and sit-ins in front of like buildings that are being demolished. This is the Avion building again, you know, this was back a year ago where like just ordinary citizens, they went there and tried to claim the rights to protect this building for the entire city. It's not only belongs to this like owner over there, but it should be protected for the city itself. They started like to use social media, which is something very fashionable in Egypt and very effective. So we see like different groups like Save Alexandria, where like they started, which was one of the most active groups in Egypt right now. And later on, there have been like Save Mansoura and Save Port Said and Save Cairo, like in all different cities that these like bottom-up movements started to come up and try to change the way we perceive heritage and protect it for the city, and to talk about the quality of life in the city and its relationship to heritage. There have been projects that have been engaging local residents in historic areas, so projects that try to upgrade these neighborhoods from like bottom-up approach, where people go and discuss with the local residents what needs to be done in their neighborhoods in terms of improving the quality of life. So the discussion is not really centered around heritage, it's about how to maintain the quality of life that is being like provided by such historic context, or let's say traditional neighborhoods. There have been efforts of local community groups, for example, to access their own heritage. In fact, this group of like local inhabitants, they put a lot of pressure on the government to open a historic mansion in their neighborhood that they used to visit when they were so young, actually. It's been closed for more than 30 years, and they have been able, after putting a lot of pressure on the government, to reopen it and force the government to restore it. And now they're meeting every Friday and the weekend. Actually, they have breakfast there in front of the building to show that they care, and they are going to come back to the mansion until it's restored. And every week they do that, and they put this pressure on the government to restore the building. There have been like whistleblowers, so people who've been like watching over like what's happening in terms of like violations or looting of monuments or destruction of like historic buildings or whatever, and they now cooperating with rights groups and lawyers actually to hold the government accountable for its responsibilities, and this works actually, either in terms of like legal battles or in terms of media, access to media, and the ability to expose the government to a large number of people. And finally, there is like another kind of activism. This is a bit weird, that this is a group of like young men that started what we call the Egyptian Heritage Rescue Team. And this is a group, only one of them actually works for the government. The rest are like independent restorers that have been trained in different international organizations like ICROM, like by Getty Institute, by different agencies and donors. And they were the ones who saved the entire collection of the Islamic Museum after the explosion. They went in, actually the same day, they transferred everything in 24 hours, 2,500 pieces, actually in 24 hours, and they have been highly trained, and it was like a completely independent initiative, actually, of them to bring themselves together. And they filled the gap where the state doesn't have any emergency or response plans actually in place. Okay, so what's the relationship between heritage and democracy in this case, and how we can bring it to the discourse? First is that one of the things that we need to recognize that we're dealing with a very soft state. So no matter what we hold the government accountable or we say that they should do their job, they're not capable of doing it, at least in the moment. The government is so weak. So what can we do in such a situation? Second, how can people gain access to their heritage, actually? And a lot of like historic sites and buildings, in terms for the National Archives, for example, you need like state security approval to access the National Archives to see anything about like your history and the history of your country. So It's not accessible to researchers, to ordinary people. People don't know that like many museums exist actually in the country. So there is the problem of access and access to information, access to heritage. Third, how to hold the state accountable. The whole system is dysfunctional. There is no accountability system. The governance structure is so weak and it's not working in a way that people can actually question the government and hold it accountable. So how can we deal with that? And then how we can address the social and economic dimensions of heritage conservation. Places like historic Cairo, for example, it's not like lucrative at all to abide by the existing regulations in terms of like development. It's almost impossible to make money if you build a house over there following the existing regulations. So how we can deal with that? If people had like this Aguillon villa, actually the owner had an offer to sell it for almost like $6-7 million US. Would he just leave it for heritage for the city and get no compensation for that, or what should we do? And there are thousands of buildings that are listed like that. What should the government do about it? And finally, how we can like address the issue of heritage from the social function of property perspective, which means like how to separate between ownership rights and development rights on the other hand. This is a big question actually that a country like Egypt has to face, because in the end, owners of these buildings, they have rights, but in the end, they don't have these rights to demolish the buildings and deprive the rest of the country from this heritage that they own. And yet, there is no solution that is being introduced to address these issues. Finally, what we've learned through our work, it's all about people. Actually, we've been doing a lot of like rehabilitation projects and restoration projects, and then they fall apart because either there hasn't been enough buy-in from the local inhabitants, the government structure didn't work, people didn't perceive the value of the project because we didn't work enough with them to understand what are their needs and their dimensions. So I would borrow Abraham Lincoln's words and say, like, heritage of the people, protected by the people, works for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And I conclude with that. Thank you.